It's their first taste of freedom. Researchers are releasing several Przewalski horses into the wild.
It's the only truly wild horse on Earth.
In December of 1986, 11 horses walked off a cargo plane onto a stretch of Chinese desert so dead that local ranchers had stopped calling it land at all and simply called it the place where nothing grows. And every serious ecologist watching this unfold called it, flatly, a death sentence. A film crew flew in specifically to document the release, packed up after 2 days, convinced they were filming a slow-motion disaster. And what those 11 animals did next, over the following 4 decades, is something almost nobody on the planet believed was actually possible. To understand why this story is so genuinely staggering, you first need to understand exactly what these animals were, because they are not ordinary horses in any sense of the word. They are Przewalski's horses, the very last truly wild horse species remaining anywhere on Earth, and they had been completely extinct in this exact region for 17 straight years. The Chinese government had just spent millions of dollars flying these zoo-born animals halfway around the planet from breeding facilities in East Germany and the United States, only to release them into a desert that was actively swallowing roughly 3,000 square kilometers of new ground every single year. Top ecologists were already calling the entire project throwing good money after dead soil. These were animals that had spent their entire lives eating hay out of buckets and drinking from automatic waterers. And now they were being dropped into a landscape where winter temperatures crashed to 40 below zero, and summer heat spiked past 100 degrees, where the nearest available water source could sit 15 kilometers away, buried under 4 inches of solid ice. Even physically, these horses look almost otherworldly. Stocky, muscular builds, stiff, upright manes standing straight up like something drawn by a child, faint zebra-like stripes running down their legs. Less like a modern domestic animal, and more like something scratched into a cave wall by our ancestors 40,000 years ago. Desert survival specialists at the time gave the herd, at best, roughly a 15% chance of surviving that very first winter. One ecologist writing in a major scientific journal described the whole undertaking as pouring money into dead soil. Local government officials in the surrounding county were reportedly already drafting public statements to explain the inevitable failure, and to understand why anyone in their right mind would attempt something this audacious in the first place, you need to understand exactly what this particular stretch of desert, the Junggar Basin, had actually become by 1986, because this was never simply a quirky animal conservation story. This was a genuine attempt to save an entire region of China from becoming permanently uninhabitable. The Junggar Basin was not always a wasteland. For roughly 10,000 years, wild horses had roamed across this steppe, and the entire local ecosystem had quietly evolved directly around the rhythm of their hoofbeats. Then, in 1969, they vanished, not gradually over years, but essentially all at once. The last confirmed sighting was logged by a Soviet geological survey crew, a scattering of hoofprints pressed into dried mud, a handful of stray hairs caught on desert grass. After that, nothing. And here is the part almost nobody anticipated. What followed was an ecological collapse, severe enough to shock even the most pessimistic scientists studying the region. Without horses continually pounding the surface, the soil gradually hardened into something researchers began calling, quite literally, biological concrete. Rain still fell across the basin, 4 to 6 inches every year, but instead of soaking into the ground, that water simply sheeted across an impermeable crust and evaporated within hours. Seeds could no longer push through the hardened surface to germinate at all. Nitrogen levels crashed so severely that by 1974, scientists were openly comparing soil samples from the basin to lunar dust. The physical material was still technically there. The individual grains of sand and silt looked identical under a microscope, but the basin had simply gone biologically dead. And then the desert itself started moving. Satellite imagery from 1982 showed the Gobi expanding at a rate of roughly 70 kilometers per decade, swallowing grassland, farmland, and entire villages whole. Highways had to be physically relocated. Rail lines were slowly being buried under drifting sand. Beijing, more than 1,000 miles away, was getting hammered repeatedly by dust storms that lasted for days at a stretch. In March of 1983, one single storm dumped an estimated 43,000 tons of Junggar Basin topsoil directly onto the Chinese capital in under 72 hours. Hospitals across the city reported a 300% spike in respiratory emergencies almost overnight. People were quite literally choking on a desert they couldn't even see, breathing in soil that had originated 1,000 miles from where they stood. So China tried absolutely everything it could think of. The Green Great Wall Project, launched in 1978, aimed to plant a forested barrier stretching 4,500 kilometers along the country's entire northern frontier. But here was the catch nobody fully anticipated. Those trees needed far more water than the surrounding desert could actually provide. Water tables that had remained stable for centuries dropped by as much as 12 meters in some regions. The trees themselves, planted in tidy, orderly rows, began dying from the bottom up as their roots failed to reach water. Tables that kept dropping further out of reach. Entire villages had to be relocated when their wells simply ran dry. Engineers tried straw-based sand-fixing grids. They tried planting drought-resistant shrubs across the frontier. Nothing genuinely held the line. By 1985, the entire situation had become a full-blown national crisis. Agricultural productivity across Xinjiang province had fallen by roughly 34%. The desert was closing in on Beijing faster with every passing year, and computer models at the time projected that, at the current rate of expansion, the Chinese capital itself could become borderline uninhabitable by the year 2050. That was the exact disaster a small group of Chinese ecologists, led by a researcher named Yang Jianming, was staring directly at when they walked into a government meeting in 1985 and proposed something that must have sounded, to the officials in that room, like pure fantasy. Yang stood in front of decision-makers who had already spent 2 decades watching tree after tree quietly die, watching wells run dry across the countryside, watching dust slowly consume their own capital city, and he told them, plainly, to stop. Stop fighting the desert with bulldozers and endless tree farms. Instead, bring back the one animal that had kept this exact landscape alive since the last ice age. Bring back the wild horse. By every account, the room did not immediately love this idea, but the underlying numbers were so bad, and the previous approaches had failed so completely that within a matter of months, his proposal was formally approved, leaving behind exactly one enormous open question. How could zoo-born animals, fed by human hands for 3 consecutive generations, possibly survive in a landscape actively eating entire cities? The Przewalski's horse is not merely another breed of horse. Examine its DNA and you'll find 66 chromosomes compared to the 64 carried by every single domestic horse on the planet. It's the only horse species on Earth that has never once been domesticated, never broken, never trained to accept a rider. While human breeders spent millennia engineering Arabians for raw speed and Clydesdales for sheer muscle, Przewalski's horses remained essentially unchanged from the era when our distant ancestors were painting their likeness onto cave walls. They are, quite literally, a living window into the last ice age. But here's the genuinely wild part of the story. By 1985, that entire evolutionary window was nearly closed for good. Only about 900 of these animals existed anywhere on the planet, and every single one of them lived inside a zoo enclosure. The entire surviving species traced its lineage back to somewhere between 12 and 14 individual horses, captured between 1899 and 1903 by Russian explorers working on commission for European zoo collectors. After the devastation of World War II, the global population bottomed out at just 31 horses total, with only 9 of them still capable of reproducing at all. At one genuinely terrifying point in the mid-20th century, the entire species survived in exactly 2 places on Earth, the Munich Zoo and the Prague Zoo. Every single Przewalski's horse alive today still carries that severe genetic bottleneck inside its cells, a permanent chromosomal scar from coming within inches of vanishing forever. The simple fact that there were any horses left to send to China at all in 1986 was, by itself, something close to a small miracle. China's plan, drafted in 1985 and formally launched in 1986, unfolded across 3 distinct phases. First, import horses directly from Western zoos and slowly acclimatize them at a newly built breeding center in Junggar. Second, gradually transition them into massive semi-wild enclosures, essentially attempting to teach zoo-raised animals how to become wild again from scratch. Third, ultimately release them into the Kalamyali Nature Reserve, roughly 4,000 square kilometers of some of the harshest terrain found anywhere in Asia. Among the very first horses moved into the Junggar enclosures was a young stallion carrying a clean white blaze running down his face. The keepers there named him Hong. Remember that name, because it matters later. Yang's argument to the Chinese government was never simply that these horses would manage to survive. His actual claim was considerably bolder, that they would actively rebuild the entire surrounding ecosystem. These horses, he explained, do not merely eat grass, they engineer entire landscapes, and once you understand exactly how, the whole premise stops sounding remotely crazy. It comes down to essentially 3 separate mechanisms, and the first is pure brute physical force. Each adult horse weighs somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds, and when running at full speed, their hooves strike the ground with roughly 800 pounds of pressure per square inch, more concentrated force than an industrial jackhammer generates. In a landscape like the Junggar Basin, where the soil had effectively hardened into biological concrete, that is precisely the kind of raw force required to shatter the hardened crust and let rainwater finally penetrate back into the ground. But here's the critical detail no bulldozer or machine could ever replicate. These horses are remarkably selective in where they apply that force. They instinctively walk around fragile young plants. They concentrate their pounding specifically on bare soil and already dead vegetation. They somehow know the difference. Then there's the distinctive way these horses actually move across the landscape. GPS tracking data would later reveal that Przewalski's horses travel roughly 15 kilometers a day in what mathematicians describe as fractal movement patterns. They graze intensively in one specific spot for hours, then abruptly relocate several miles away, then eventually circle back around. On the surface, it looks completely random. It is anything but. This exact movement pattern creates what ecologists call a disturbance mosaic across the landscape. Short grass in one patch, tall grass in another, bare open ground scattered in between. Each of these tiny microhabitats ends up supporting an entirely different mix of insects, birds, and small mammals. These horses aren't simply grazing, they are, in a very real sense, actively designing a patchwork ecosystem with their own footsteps. And here's the third mechanism, arguably the strangest one of all. Horse manure, it turns out, is not simply biological waste. It functions as an active seed delivery system. Detailed analysis of Przewalski's horse dung revealed viable seeds from more than 20 distinct plant species, and the journey through a horse's digestive tract actually improves overall seed germination rates by as much as 300%. The acids inside their digestive system scarify tough seed coats and break dormancy in seeds that would have otherwise remained locked shut for years, sometimes decades. A single gram of horse dung can contain up to 7.4 viable seedlings, roughly double the dispersal rate produced by cattle and 8 times the rate produced by sheep. And because these horses cover roughly 15 kilometers of territory every single day, they end up seeding vast stretches of land, quietly building genetic corridors between plant populations that had been geographically isolated from one another for decades. Every single pile of dung left behind functions in effect as a self-watering, pre-fertilized seed packet. That was Yang's entire pitch, and that was the underlying theory. The genuine problem was that the horses about to be released had spent 3 to 4 full generations living entirely behind fences. They didn't know how to locate water sources buried in a desert. They didn't recognize the distant howl of a wolf as a genuine threat. Most had never once experienced a temperature below freezing or above roughly 90 degrees. Researchers describe this missing piece as the culture of survival, the specific learned behaviors passed down from mother to foal that no amount of raw genetic programming can ever fully replace on its own. So the single question that would ultimately decide whether Yang was a genuine visionary or simply a fool was refreshingly simple. Had 3 consecutive generations of zoo life permanently erased the instincts buried deep in these animals? Or were those instincts still in there somewhere, quietly waiting to be reawakened? The first several months at Junggar became a fight that very nearly proved every single critic right. Within just a few weeks, botfly infestations had spread through 100% of the entire herd, and these were not ordinary garden variety parasites. The larvae burrowed directly into the horses' stomach linings, creating painful internal lesions that severely disrupted their digestion at precisely the moment they needed every available calorie simply to survive. Then came the first winter, and that first winter was nothing short of apocalyptic. Temperatures fell to a brutal 42 degrees below zero. Horses accustomed to heated barns huddled together against frozen winds cutting across the open desert like razor blades, their distinctive upright manes freezing solid into icy ridges so thick that some animals genuinely couldn't lift their heads off the ground. Snow buried what little available grass existed under 3 full feet of powder. And here is where the situation turned genuinely brutal. The research staff at Junggar, Yang's own team, watched all of this unfold through binoculars, under strict orders not to intervene unless the entire herd faced total, imminent death. 7 horses developed severe frostbite. 2 pregnant. Mares lost their foals to the cold. International press outlets were already quietly drafting the obituary for this entire project. Conservation journals were preparing formal postmortems of what everyone assumed would become a textbook failure. Yang himself later admitted he was privately bracing for the absolute worst outcome. But something else entirely, something nobody had scripted or predicted, was quietly beginning to unfold out on that frozen steppe. Stallions started breaking through surface ice with their own hooves to reach the liquid water hidden beneath, a specific behavior that had never once been observed in any zoo anywhere on the planet. Mares started forming tight, protective formations around their foals during the worst storms, physically using their own bodies as windbreaks and rotating positions whenever one mare grew dangerously cold. The horses learned to dig through deep snow using a sweeping motion of their front legs, uncovering buried grass that no domestic horse would have ever thought to search for. They began reading the wind itself, learning to recognize which slopes had been swept clear by the cold and which had banked deep with drifted snow. And to put it plainly, they weren't merely surviving, they were remembering. Generations spent behind fences had not erased what was still written deep in their bones. The instincts had simply been dormant, quietly waiting. This unforgiving desert was waking them back up. By the spring of 1987, the transformation accelerated well past anything the project's own planners had projected. Grass species that hadn't been documented in the basin for 17 full years began sprouting in the exact areas where horses had been grazing. Compensatory growth, the well-documented phenomenon where grasses regrow faster and thicker after being clipped, increased overall biomass by 43% in grazed areas compared to identical ungrazed control plots. These horses weren't destroying the landscape. They were actively stimulating it back to life. The soil itself began changing in ways that genuinely stunned the monitoring scientists. In that very first year alone, moisture retention across the site jumped 23%. Not because rainfall had increased and not because the regional climate had shifted, but because horse hooves had hammered roughly 10,000 tiny craters into every single hectare of land. Each one of those small depressions became a miniature reservoir, capturing precious rainwater that would have otherwise sheeted off the hard pan and evaporated within hours. The horses were, quite literally, rebuilding the basin's entire plumbing system one footstep at a time. The second year brought yet another surprise. Nitrogen levels across the site surged by 37%, because horse manure wasn't just fertilizing the soil directly, it was actively reintroducing the exact gut bacteria and microbial communities that soil had been missing for decades, an entire biological network that had vanished the moment the original wild horses disappeared. By the third year, botanists on site were documenting something that should have been genuinely impossible. 22 separate plant species had returned from seemingly nowhere at all, their seeds apparently lying dormant in the ground for nearly 2 full decades, patiently waiting for exactly the right conditions to finally germinate. The basin, it turned out, had never actually been dead. It had simply been sleeping, waiting for the one species that still knew how to wake it back up. But surviving a single winter is not the same thing as restoring an entire population, and these horses still had to do it again, and the second winter, when it finally arrived, would genuinely test whether that first miraculous season represented the beginning of something real, or simply an improbable one-time fluke. It was not a fluke. The horses made it through the second winter, and the third, and the fourth, and once the plants had firmly reestablished themselves, everything else in the ecosystem quickly followed suit. Dung beetles, completely absent from the basin for roughly 15 years, returned in the millions, bearing horse manure and further enriching the soil, accelerating the entire recovery cycle even faster. Field surveys began counting 43 separate insect species that hadn't been recorded anywhere in the region for decades. Those insects, in turn, attracted the birds back. Larks, wheat ears, and sand grouse moved in specifically to feed. Small mammals followed close behind the birds. Gerbils, pikas, and ground squirrels reestablished themselves across the site. And then, inevitably, the predators returned as well. Foxes, steppe eagles, and even the occasional gray wolf began quietly appearing on camera traps scattered across the reserve. Every single new species added another layer of ecological complexity, another feedback loop actively driving the entire recovery process forward. By the late 1990s, the herd at Jimisar had grown large enough, and the surrounding basin had recovered enough, that Yang's team made a decision that would have sounded genuinely insane just a decade earlier. They decided to take the fences down entirely. In August of 2001, the project entered its boldest and riskiest phase yet. 27 horses were carefully selected for full, permanent release into the Kalamaile Nature Reserve. No fences whatsoever, no supplemental feeding, no human intervention of any kind, for any reason. Just the horses themselves, alone in 4,000 square kilometers of desert that hadn't seen their kind in 32 straight years. Among those 27 released horses was Hong, the stallion with the distinctive white blaze, now fully grown and leading his own established harem. Scientists fitted the herd with GPS tracking collars, positioned camera traps across the reserve, and quite literally held their breath. For the entire first week, the horses stayed within about 500 meters of the exact release point, almost as if tethered to invisible chains. They drifted in nervous circles. They grazed cautiously. They kept glancing back toward the enclosure they'd just left. And then came day 8. It happened just after dawn, with a steady wind blowing in from the northwest, according to the field notes. The GPS monitoring team back at the research station was watching their screens, mostly out of routine habit at that point, when one single dot on the map suddenly started moving. Then the dots surrounding it started moving too. Hong was already on his feet, and his entire harem was falling in line directly behind him. He wasn't drifting aimlessly, he wasn't grazing. He walked due north in an almost perfectly straight line, moving exactly as though he already knew precisely where he was going. The dots on the screen kept moving steadily, 5 kilometers, then 10, then 15. The monitoring team began making urgent phone calls. By the time Hong finally stopped moving, he had led his entire harem 30 kilometers north, directly to a water source that appeared on absolutely none of the project's existing maps. Nobody had ever told him it was there. No previous generation of his own bloodline had ever walked that particular route within his own lifetime. He simply knew. Researchers drove out the following morning to confirm what the GPS data had already told them, and there it was. A spring-fed pool, half frozen over, tucked quietly against a low ridge. Hong stood beside it as calmly as if he'd been visiting that exact spot his entire life. Exactly how he knew remains one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of this entire project. Some kind of ancestral memory, a specific scent carried on the wind, a subtle pattern in the surrounding geology that horses can somehow read and human beings simply cannot. Within a single month, the released horses had already carved out distinct territories across the reserve. Stallions marked their boundaries with dung piles deliberately placed on raised, visible ground. Natural foaling rates ran 87% higher than what most zoo populations typically achieve. And the foals being born out in the genuinely wild landscape displayed behaviors that captive-born horses simply never exhibit at all. They could reportedly distinguish 23 different plant species purely by scent. They instinctively froze in place at the mere shadow of a passing golden eagle overhead. They grew noticeably thicker winter coats than even their own parents had, and the broader landscape transformation was now becoming genuinely visible from orbit. Satellite imagery showed green vegetation patches steadily expanding outward from each horse territory, like slow-motion explosions rippling across the desert. The local water table, which had been steadily dropping by roughly 3 centimeters every year since 1970, finally stabilized in 2003. And then it actually began to rise. These horses had somehow switched a dormant hydrological pump back on, one that had sat completely off for an entire generation. What was unfolding in the Junggar Basin ultimately shattered nearly everything China believed it understood about fighting back against desertification. For 25 straight years, the entire Green Great Wall program had operated on one single premise: plant enough trees to physically stop the sand. By 2010, China had planted a staggering 66 billion trees at a total cost of roughly $47 billion, and across many regions, those trees had actually made the underlying water crisis dramatically worse, pulling groundwater out of the earth far faster than the surrounding land could ever naturally replenish it. And here is the detail that genuinely should have changed everything. While China's massive tree planting program was effectively drinking the desert drier with every passing year, these horses were accomplishing precisely the opposite. They were actively bringing the water back. Their hooves created countless infiltration points that allowed rare rainfall to finally penetrate deep into the soil instead of evaporating uselessly off a hardened crust. Their continuous grazing maintained open grassland, which requires roughly 90% less water overall than dense forest cover. A single horse alone was measurably improving water retention across roughly 50 hectares of land every single year. Then somebody finally sat down and ran the actual numbers, and the results stopped sounding like straightforward ecology and started sounding a lot more like hard economics. When ecological economists calculated the true value a single Przewalski's horse provided to its surrounding ecosystem, they arrived at a figure nobody had genuinely expected. Soil restoration alone was valued at roughly $12,000 per horse per year. Seed dispersal added another $8,000. Water retention contributed $15,000. Carbon sequestration added $7,000 more. Biodiversity support contributed an additional $5,000. The total came out to roughly $47,000 of measurable ecological value, generated by a single horse every single year. When researchers finally ran the cumulative number across the entire herd, they became the next group, after the documentary crew and the conservation journals before them, forced to take a hard second look at their own results before they were willing to fully trust them. Because by 2023, those original 11 horses had grown into a population of 534. That herd was now effectively managing roughly 26,700 hectares of restored land, an area larger than many established national parks, generating an estimated $25 million in measurable ecological benefit every single year. And that figure was a deliberately conservative estimate that didn't even include tourism revenue, scientific research value, or the basin's growing value in formal carbon offset markets. Among those 534 horses by that point were dozens of Hong's own direct descendants, scattered across the reserve-leading harems of their own. The once dead soil they had originally been released onto now supported more than 20 distinct plant species that hadn't grown there in decades. And the desert that had once been expanding by thousands of square kilometers every year was now actively retreating, pulling back at a documented rate of roughly 47 hectares every year, specifically within the zones where these horses roamed freely. This exact model spread rapidly beyond China's borders. Mongolia released its own herd of Przewalski's horses into Hustai National Park back in 1992, and by 2023, that population had grown past 490 individuals, with the surrounding steppe showing precisely the same restoration patterns already documented in Xinjiang. Kazakhstan launched its own Golden Steppe project, transporting additional horses directly from Prague and Berlin into the Kostanay region. And within a matter of years, that population had already grown past 100 animals, with nearly 1,000 horses now roaming freely across wider Central Asia. Russian researchers have reportedly been quietly studying China's original data as well. Every single one of these independent projects kept proving the exact same underlying principle. You cannot engineer a functioning ecosystem from the top down using purely human designs and poured concrete. You have to restore it patiently from the bottom up, using evolutionary solutions that have already been rigorously field-tested over hundreds of thousands of years. China is currently expanding the Kalamaili Reserve by an additional 350 square kilometers, with an official long-term goal of reaching 2,500 wild horses by the year 2040. Current computer models suggest a population of that size could ultimately restore more than 100,000 hectares of severely degraded land, lock away an estimated 43,000 tons of carbon every single year, and actively support more than 300 species of plants and animals that currently exist nowhere else remaining in China. If this ambitious goal is achieved, the Junggar Basin would become the very first desert in recorded human history to be genuinely reversed, not through tree planting, not through artificial irrigation, not through human engineering of any kind, but purely through the hooves of wild horses walking freely across it. The 11 animals that stepped off that cargo plane back in 1986 were never simply a handful of endangered zoo animals being relocated somewhere new. They were, in effect, a piece of biological technology, quietly refined by evolution across hundreds of thousands of years, fully capable of designing and actively maintaining an entire functioning landscape on its own. Human beings simply had to remember how to switch that technology back on. We had to stop trying to solve this crisis entirely on our own, and instead let the actual experts, the ones equipped with hooves rather than bulldozers, take over the job. This entire story forces an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many of the environmental disasters humanity is currently facing could potentially be solved by bringing back the original ecosystem engineers we ourselves drove toward extinction, instead of continuing to pour trillions of dollars into human-designed fixes that consistently fail to work? The bison that once shaped the American prairie, the wolves that still help maintain the forests of Europe, the elephants that quietly garden the savannas of Africa. We have spent the entire modern industrial era trying to engineer nature ourselves from scratch. Nature had already engineered a working solution long before we ever arrived. We simply killed it off, and then we slowly forgot the recipe entirely. So here's my honest question for you. If you could bring back just one extinct ecosystem engineer anywhere on Earth specifically to help repair land we've already damaged, which species would you personally choose, and why? Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one. And if you want more stories about animals that have quite literally reshaped entire continents, go ahead and subscribe, because the next story in this series might end up being the wildest one yet.